Looking forward to airing the show. I called some friends of mine in Washington and I said, we've got this program coming up. I've got to introduce this. And I know President Johnson's role in public television, but I'm not sure about Reagan's. What can you help me with? He said, well, that's great. Reagan appointed me to a committee at the National Endowments for Humanities, and I worked with the President, Lynn Cheney. She put me in charge of media and special projects. One of my first tasks was there was a young upstart producer that came in to look for some finished funding on a program he was working on. Lynn and I looked at some rough cuts, decided to give this person the biggest grant we ever had, and President Reagan called over and said, by the way, I'm really worried that we're losing America's history. We've got to do something about that with the media. So we went out and gave Ken Burns enough money to finish the Civil War. President Reagan wrote him a note and said, great job, young man, thanks for preserving history. And now to tell you about President Reagan is Mr. David Krauss. Please welcome.
Thank you, Michael. As he said, my name's David Krauss. I'm the executive producer of the Reagan Presidency, but also a longtime family friend of Mike's family. His father was a very, very close friend of ours. He was our local pharmacist. We were summering in Petoskey at the time, but Dr. Walenta was always a imposing figure, but a great guy as well. And it's nice to see so many friends here. And it's wonderful to be in this magnificent building. You should be very, very proud of what you have, not only here in Grand Rapids, but also for the entire country. It's a masterpiece. And I want to thank you on behalf of Chip Duncan for inviting us to be here tonight to talk about that man right there, and what better place, right? The Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. I did a little background research. I knew about the center, but when I read what the center's mission is, the three objectives, I thought, wow, this sort of has Ronald Reagan written all over it. Honors the founder's vision of a constitutional republic, builds on existing democratic institutions that promote justice, freedom, opportunity, sustainable prosperity, and the rule of law. And third, envisions the possibilities for creating better communities. I think Ronald Reagan called that the shining city on the hill. And we are Chip and I have been on a sort of a dog and pony show, as they say, but a great one. This is our fifth event in 7 nights. And what we can now say, which we could not say a week ago, because we started in Petoskey, was that we've been overwhelmed by the size of audiences that are turning out to see clips as well as to see the documentary. We achieved almost 500 people earlier this week in Ohio, and I think it's indicative of this hunger for anything there is about Ronald Reagan. Very quickly, why Reagan, why now? I saw Ronald Reagan for the first time in 1976. I was a news reporter for an NBC affiliate, and I'm guessing there are some in this audience tonight that were out in Kemper Arena in Kansas City. Show of hands, yep, there's 1, 2. When the convention was over, without getting into the details, with the Ford Presidential Museum just a few blocks away, you know that it was a bitterly contested primary. And after President Ford had given his acceptance speech and the network cameras turned off and went back to local programming, the president invited Ronald and Nancy Reagan down to the stage. And as you know probably now through YouTube, he gave one of the electrifying speeches that nobody saw. And the speech dealt with patriotism, and it dealt with nuclear annihilation. And what's interesting about nuclear annihilation is the fact that we delve into it in very serious, substantive way in hours 2 and 3. And I think it's indicative because many felt that Reagan was, in fact, a loose cannon. We have this mythical image of Ronald Reagan today as a peacemaker. After all, he really didn't fight any wars under his term. He did have a couple of incursions. But the fact that he came into office with this fear that Reagan was going to pull the trigger, particularly with the Eastern European and Russian scholars that are interviewed for this documentary. There was genuine fear. So for me, it was started in 1976, and then it ended in 1992. I had an opportunity several times during that period to meet the president in the White House. But in 1992, Chip Duncan and I had the opportunity of going out to the Reagan, to his office in Los Angeles to tape him essentially for an opening to a PBS documentary that we were producing. And little did we know, little did the American public know that that would be one of the final tapings that the president did at that time. So tonight what we're going to show you are clips that Chip has pulled out to give you a sense of flavor of what the documentary is going to be about. But I want to take a personal moment here, and I want to thank Mike and WGVU for airing this documentary. Chip and I have been in this business a long time. Our programs have aired from A&E to the Discovery Channel to the Learning Channel and public broadcasting. We prefer, by an overwhelming sentiment on our part, to work in the world of public broadcasting. It is the most trusted name in the industry. It's the most trusted name among the American public. And just so you know, we did not receive any government funds for this film. Public broadcasting did not pay us for this film. They air it free. Our monies that we get come through corporate sponsors. Graciously, you see the local sponsors here, of which we are grateful for. Thank you. But we're also grateful for our major funders. Boeing, Aircraft Manufacturing, Boeing, as well as BNSF Railway. They are our two primary funders, and I give them a thanks. And I'll end by saying Tom Downey, who's the Senior Vice President of Corporate Communications for Boeing, in one of our meetings that we had, Chip and I had with him, he said, you know, and they had no editorial control whatsoever in this program. He said, you know, I hope that this becomes a civic lesson, the film, the miniseries, for a group of Americans that were not alive during the 1980s. And I hope and I think when you see the airing of this next week here locally, that you will also get a sense that, yeah, it was definitely a civics lesson. So much took place in the 1980s that we have forgotten about, and most of it was frightening. So I want to take a moment to introduce Chip Duncan. He and I have had the great pleasure of working together for 23 years. I like to say I raise the money, and he spends it. He's the writer, producer, director. He is a published author. He is also a great photographer who has exhibitions that are around the country. But most importantly, he's a great humanitarian. He has been in a lot of hot spots in this world just in the past year. And though he won't get into that tonight, you can go to his website, duncanentertainment.com, to learn a little bit more about Chip. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it really over to the Master of Ceremonies, Chip Duncan.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I do want to ask the technical crew if it's okay. If I'm on the wireless mic, I'll move around a little bit. So I don't like being confined to the podium. So it's great of you all to be here tonight, and we're going to show tonight 4 clips from what is essentially a 3-hour film. I want to give you a little bit of background. This film was produced for public television. As David mentioned a moment ago, it's one of the most trusted institutions in the country. That's been backed up by extensive polling. It's actually the most trusted institution in America. There's been a Roper survey about public television which says that over 75% of the American public say that the best expenditure of American tax dollars after the Pentagon is public TV. And that's, you know, they're well known for fairness, for objectivity, and those are the values that we pursue when we produce the film. So one of the things I've learned about documentary filmmaking over the years is that a lot of times people react more to what we leave out of a production than to what we put in it. So there are probably, when you see the 3-hour film, there are probably going to be some things that you wish we would have covered that we didn't cover. So let me give you a sense of the decisions that we did make going into this production. The first decision we made was to limit the film to the period 1979 to 1989. The Reagan Presidency, we chose that title for a reason. It's not a character film. It's really a film about the presidency and the complexities of the presidency. People have asked me over the last few weeks whether my personal opinions about Reagan changed or varied in any way, and my answer is that the most profound change for me is that the complexities of the presidency, regardless of who's serving, really came to the forefront for me. There's so many things that a president cannot anticipate when they enter office, and in Reagan's case, there were a number of them. Certainly, in hour one of the film, the assassination attempt on his life is one example. The emergence of Gorbachev, the different issues that he confronted in both domestic and international policy were things that no one could have predicted at the time he came into office. Another one of the decisions we made early on, and this is based in large part on our research team and on my reading, was that we decided to split the film into an hour on domestic policy and an hour on foreign policy. Once we got into foreign policy, we realized we couldn't do justice in an hour, and we extended it to 2. But part of the reason for that was that we developed an extensive timeline of the presidency. And one of the things you see, one of the complexities of the presidency, is that they're moving back and forth from international to domestic issues literally by the hour. And we found, as researchers, that it was difficult for us to track the presidency. And so we decided to split it into domestic policy, foreign policy. So the first clip I'm going to play tonight is actually the first 4.5, 5 minutes of hour one. It sets up the entire 3 hours, and it also gives you a sense of who some of the interview subjects are that you're going to encounter throughout the film. We were fortunate in that we were able to interview a number of the key members of Reagan's team, and we were also able to include people who were in opposition, political opposition to him at the time. And probably what I consider one of the hallmarks of the film is that we're far enough away from the Reagan presidency now that we were able to bring in a whole new generation of scholars. And I'm really pleased, if nothing else, I'm very pleased with the fact that the film features a lot of young academics who've put a lot of time into the presidency. And so it's a very, very diverse group. I think you'll enjoy it. And so I'm going to start right now with the clip of the first 4.5 minutes of hour one.
My assumption was that when Reagan left, the Republican Party would spin out of control. What I didn't realize then, or at least what I think now, is that Reagan still runs the Republican Party. It's as if the man never died.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
More than 30 years after his inauguration as the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan's vision continues to shape the Republican Party.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
He was a stalwart in the conservative movement. He was genial, he was likable, he was popular with the voters.
A Washington outsider, often called the great communicator, Reagan spent more than 2 decades honing his rhetoric against the federal government and communism.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we...
Ronald Reagan was both a cold warrior and a master diplomat. It's possible to be very, very tough-minded, to believe in peace through strength, as he put it, to believe in power, and to be a good diplomat.
The choices were very obvious, either between big or small government, either between freedom and dictatorship, either between America or the Soviet Union.
We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength.
When people name the figures who were transformative. That is to say, they did more than just occupy the office, but actually changed the direction of the country in some ways. Ronald Reagan would be one of those.
The fact that he was largely successful is allowed the folklore of Reagan to rise to very high proportions in the 21st century. He's seen, like FDR, as a president who was very polarizing in their time, but who has become beloved by the general public.
His whole life had been a series of very improbable things, going from being a radio announcer to a movie star, going from being a movie star to governor of California, going from a failed presidential bid to becoming a very successful president.
Was he a man of simple conviction? Was he a hypocrite who preached his faith in God but never went to church? Was he a man who preached tax cuts but then increased taxes?
On the one hand, he came in talking about fiscal cutting the federal government. On the other hand, he had the largest federal deficits in history in a non-war period.
During the 8 years Ronald Reagan occupied the White House, legislative battles were won and lost. Taxes went down and up. The Cold War neared the end. The war on terror began. And today, issues battled and fought during the Reagan presidency continue to shape American politics and government.
From a city on a hill to the wondrous generosity of the American people. Ronald Reagan imagined all that. He imagined a history of the United States which wasn't true, and then he made it happen. It was astounding that he could do that.
Thank you. We'll try to navigate the lights. It's a little challenging, apparently, to bring them down and up. I'm not sure, but we'll do our best. In our one of the film, as I mentioned, we covered domestic policy rather extensively, and so we get into issues around the deficit. We get into issues around tax decreases, tax increases, the size of government. A lot of those issues are still incredibly relevant today. And that's one of the reasons we decided to do this film. We had done a previous film on Herbert Hoover, and we think our next film is going to be on Truman. But in this one of the things that really excited me was how incredibly relevant the domestic issues continue to be, how the battles in many ways are the same battles that are being fought. One of the ones that is a little different by today's standards, although it might resonate a bit with my home state of Wisconsin, is the professional air traffic controller strike. I'm sure many of you remember PATCO quite well. And so the next clip that I want to play for you is a clip on PATCO. And it's excerpted from roughly about a third of the way through hour one. And some of the surprises that happen when you make a film and you're open-minded and pay attention to various political and ideological backgrounds is we interviewed Robert Reich, the Secretary of Labor, under the Clinton administration. And in interviewing Rice, his comments around PATCO were really quite fascinating. And so he is one of the bigger spokespeople in this clip, and some of his comments might surprise you a little bit. So this is a clip on PATCO.
Where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost.
During the presidential campaign, Reagan had declared his support for unions. He also had a history as a union member.
I respect the right of workers in the private sector to strike. Indeed, as president of my own union, I led the first strike ever called by that union.
But when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, known as PATCO, failed to agree to a new contract with the Federal Aviation Administration, union members decided to strike, and the president reacted.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. Government cannot close down the assembly line. It has to provide without interruption the protective services which are government's reason for being.
This issue is bigger than just the threats of the government. It's a much bigger issue to our people. We will not go back to work.
The air traffic controllers had no right to strike. They were a public employee union. Not only did they have no right to strike, but a strike of air traffic controllers was very dangerous for the country. So they essentially dared Ronald Reagan to pull the plug on them and fire them. And what did Ronald Reagan do? He pulled the plug on them and he fired them.
If they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
More than 11,000 union members soon found themselves unemployed.
Many employers interpreted Ronald Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers as a kind of public license, a kind of public legitimacy to go boldly, dramatically, and publicly after unions in a way that many employers have been reluctant to do before.
It wasn't a notch in Reagan's belt in the sense that that's why he did it. But it was evidence that Reagan would take a position and would stick with it. And that was something that was very good for him as a politician.
So one of the things that happens when we're producing a show is we're limited in time to 56 minutes and 46 seconds per hour. And it's one of the most difficult things that we do is to try and fit it into exactly that period of time. So in the course of producing the first hour on domestic policy, we looked at a number of issues that we wanted to cover. At one point, we had the Challenger explosion in the film, and we had to cut it out just due to time. At one point, we had a whole section on the environment that we just couldn't fit into hour one. And a producer always has a lot of different choices to make. In this case, we decided to include a section that other people might have put on the side, and that's a section on the farm mortgage crisis. And part of that was driven by the fact that I found it to be an incredible subject. I found, our research team found archival footage that was quite stunning. But also, our partner in the production is Iowa Public Television. They're our presenting station, and farming is, as you would imagine, is a big issue in Iowa. So there were all kinds of reasons why I kept it in the film. I find this section to be one of the more interesting ones in hour one. So this is a quick section on the farm mortgage crisis.
But there was one group of Americans whose struggles mounted despite the economic recovery.
This country is nothing without the farmer. And those who work the land have the right to know that there's a future in farming.
President Reagan had expressed his appreciation for farmers for years, and agriculture-related industries accounted for a significant portion of the gross national product. But family farmers were facing challenges not seen in a generation, and some viewed the president's messages as mixed. Faced with overproduction, a depressed market, and rising debt, many families pleaded for help to avoid foreclosure on their homes and their farmland.
We have gone further and further downhill until now our net worth is zero minus. We have nothing left that we can call our own.
Our profit picture has disappeared.
We're getting a little over $2 and $5 for soybeans, and you just can't make it work.
Yes, we are sympathetic, and we will extend support. But American taxpayers must not be asked to bail out every farmer hopelessly in debt.
Dependence on government loans and subsidies was nothing new. But for this generation of farmers, the foreclosure crisis was. For some, the federal government was their last hope to preserve a lifestyle and legacy that had lasted since the nation's inception.
It's time for others to pitch in and do more. From officials at the state level to banks, private groups, and individuals in our communities, all joining in partnership to help farmers.
Some farmers organized, some fought back. Their protests were heard in Congress and at the White House. Congress and the president allocated $52 billion in aid to the beleaguered farmers, but the long-term impact on traditional family farming was considerable. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 farm businesses failed between 1980 and 1988.
I'm going to play two more clips for you tonight. The next clip I'm going to play is quite a bit longer, and it has to do with foreign policy. And when we started the film, as you can imagine, we knew we would be covering the Cold War rather extensively. And we were able to secure some very interesting interview subjects in the process. We got Condoleezza Rice, we got George Shultz, a number of other people to comment on the Cold War, but it was during our interview with George Shultz at the Hoover Institution when a very interesting comment was made. I'm paraphrasing only slightly, but Shultz said that the Reagan administration had a significant emphasis on the Cold War, but was a little less focused on Middle East policy than maybe the previous administration had been. The Cold War was the predominant issue. It had been a huge part of Reagan's entire life, and that's really where the focus was. We decided to go more extensively into the Middle East than anyone had really done before in a television documentary. There were a number of reasons why we made that decision. One of them was that history has changed dramatically since 9/11. The American worldview has changed significantly since 9/11. So we decided to start extending our reach and going into a whole different kind of research climate around Reagan's Middle East policy and looking at what some of the long-term implications were of decisions that were made, especially around 1982-83 during the Lebanese Civil War. So as we got into Hour 2 and Hour 3, and as you'll see when you watch it, a lot of what you might already know, hopefully a lot of things you don't know about the Cold War are discussed, but there's also a really strong emphasis on the Middle East. And so when you see the arc of Hour 2 and Hour 3, many of you might remember, for example, Arms for Hostages or Iran-Contra. The backstory on those issues we delve into extensively. So in fact, I would say, for me personally, it was difficult to understand Iran-Contra or Arms for Hostages without understanding what was going on with the Iran-Iraq War or the Lebanese Civil War or the birth of Hezbollah and any number of other things. So in the process of extending that, we added a number of new interview subjects to our section on foreign policy, including Sam Lewis, who was the U.S. ambassador to Israel both under Carter and Reagan in the first 4 years, and Robert Bud McFarlane, who became, I think, quite possibly the most interesting interview of the entire 3 hours. When we interviewed McFarland, we did that interview in Washington, D.C. It was about 18 months ago. We expected to talk with him for maybe an hour, hour and a half. He gave us 2.5 hours. And to be honest, we were not done. If he hadn't had a dental appointment to go to, we'd still be talking. But he was definitely one of the more fascinating interviews. On the Soviet policy side, Condoleezza Rice was chosen because, some of you may know this, but she was a Soviet scholar at Stanford at the time of the Reagan administration. So we went to Condoleezza Rice really as a Soviet scholar, not as a former Secretary of State. We interviewed her in Chicago, and by contrast, her schedule, as you can imagine, was quite tight. We only had about 35 minutes with Condoleezza Rice. But the foreign policy side really evolved and really opened up. And as David mentioned, and as a person who really kind of came into his own during the 1980s, that was a period of extraordinary fear. The fear of nuclear war at that time was very high. There was a strong peace movement taking place, but there was also a real strong movement towards building up the American military in hopes of putting pressure on the Soviet Union, some of it economic pressure, some of it Star Wars. All of those things are covered. But we tried to, in the beginning of Hour 2, set the stage for what that fear looked like. And we're going to play the clip that opens Hour 2, and really the whole section on foreign policy. This clip is a little bit longer. It's a roughly 8-minute clip, and then I'll come back and talk and play one more clip after that. So.
If the Soviets do not withdraw their troops immediately from Afghanistan, I would not support the sending of an American team to the Olympics.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever.
When Ronald Reagan took office on January 20th, 1981, he assumed leadership of one of the two most powerful nations on earth. The United States and the Soviet Union had been at odds for more than a generation. The Cold War conflict was symbolized by the wall dividing East and West Germany, and global alliances that, with few exceptions, took one side or the other.
It seemed a permanent feature of international politics. We were locked, after all, into this nuclear balance. We were locked into a system, a bipolar system. The Soviet Union had its friends and allies. We had our friends and allies.
The situation was seen as being very dangerous. War was something which people thought of in real terms, not just, oh, theoretically there might be a possibility.
The whole logic of this competition led us to believe that the Cold War was a zero-sum game, that for one to win, the other had to lose.
Germans were vividly aware that if nuclear war was going to happen, a lot of it was going to happen on their territory, which meant partial or complete obliteration of the nation that we lived in. That was a slightly different feeling than growing up, say, in the Midwest.
Reagan, naturally communicating with God, recognized his role was going to be to do away with nuclear weapons, not to increase them. That the key of his presidency was to make the world a safer place, not a more dangerous place.
He wanted to engage them on a moral plane. He felt that too often in détente, which his predecessors had followed, we had been too easy on the Soviet Union and not explained how evil they were.
President Reagan had lived through the 35 years of the Cold War and came to office with a fundamentally different view. He believed détente was wrong.
It's one thing to engage when the engagement is around peaceful coexistence and détente. It's quite another when you've set the terms as an end to Soviet power, and that engagement is toward that outcome.
So as you can see, we plant two seeds in that open, one around the Middle East, one around the Soviet Union. And it's been interesting because what Chiron Skinner, the scholar from the Hoover Institution, said there is that people know the 1980s as the decade when the Cold War ended, but they don't necessarily think of the 1980s as the beginning of the war on terror. And that was probably the most profound discovery for us and the most significant part of putting hours 2 and 3 of this film together. I mentioned when we started, and this will be the last clip, by the way, and then we'll do some Q&A, but I mentioned when we started that one of the things that I learned in the process of making the film was I developed a much greater respect for the complexities of the presidency, regardless of who might be serving. And Reagan's a really interesting example of that, and you see it in the evolution of his presidency. And in particular, and especially for those of us who lived through that era, there's a profound change that occurs in the Soviet Union. And I know that a lot of people will say, for example, that Reagan won the Cold War. Our scholars, and certainly many people who were in the administration, like to set the record a little more straight and say Reagan and Gorbachev ended the Cold War, that it was the combined efforts of these two people. And so as our story evolves, and for those of you who may not know this part of history, when Reagan came into office, Brezhnev was the general secretary of the Soviet Union. And then there was Andropov, and then there was Chernyenko. And so he outlived three of the leaders of the Soviet Union, and then Gorbachev comes along, and change really happens with the emergence of Gorbachev. So the last clip that I'll play, and then we can do Q&A, is a clip about the emergence of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union.
With proxy wars in Central America and Afghanistan, strategic challenges in the Middle East, and U.S. missile deployment ramped up in Western Europe, relations between superpowers had rarely been worse. As those in the White House considered their options, Ronald Reagan could not have known that his partner for change, real change, was waiting in the wings of the Politburo. After an unremarkable 13 months as General Secretary, Konstantin Chernenko died. His successor, 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev, assumed office as the youngest Soviet leader in more than 3 decades.
Brezhnev died, Andropov died, Chernenko died, and then finally you get Gorbachev.
People saw in Mikhail Gorbachev a much more moderate reformer, and somebody who I think a lot of West Europeans felt was someone that they could live with.
When it became clear that Gorbachev actually wanted reform, that was the first glimmer of hope for Europe in many decades.
Gorbachev was a sensation. He was young. He looked healthy. He moved.
The main feature for Gorbachev was not only absurdity, but actually impossibility of the nuclear war. So that meant for Gorbachev that this kind of war, in any case, not only could not be won, but could not be fought.
The Soviet Union had to come to a particular place in its own history where it was vulnerable to an American push to roll it back. Mikhail Gorbachev is a part of that story because he thought he could reform the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev is formidable because if he didn't have a new type of Soviet leader ready to do business, I'm not sure Reagan's charm would have overwhelmed them.
You know, his speech sounded to us then so sophisticated. Like, he was a Moscow University graduate. We felt, wow. But the style changed, and there was this feeling of fresh blood. Oh my God, he can talk. That's what we told each other. He answers questions. He reacts. He thinks.
So what you see there is that the emergence of Gorbachev, which was not predictable, actually has a huge impact on the relations between the Soviets and the Americans. And of course, many of us in the room know what happens. First there's the convention in Geneva, and then in Reykjavik, and then 2 more after that, and change really occurs in a significant way. And it's really these 2 men coming together to create it that we play out in hours 2 and 3 of the film. So,
well, my first question for you is going to be about your next show. Tell us about Truman and have a seat, and then these folks will have all their questions lined up.
That was your idea, right, Truman?
well, I think we address it fairly significantly in part 1. There's a lot of discussion of different legislation and reform that was passed that was bipartisan. And we did have people talking from both sides. So I would say the Social Security Reform Act in particular, the Tax Reform Act, and you have people in hour 1 talking about it from various points of view. Immigration also was covered rather extensively. So we did not get very heavily into the relationship between the president and O'Neill, but it's referenced, Isabel. I have a question for David. I know we've had the pleasure of speaking to some larger groups over the last week, and one of the questions we have had, both in some of the receptions and in some of the more formal gatherings like this, is really people seem to be very intrigued with the process of how we go about making. And the fundraising process, obviously no film happens if the fundraising process doesn't happen first. And David mentioned our funders. We were funded principally for this film by Boeing Corporation and by BNSF. And they're obviously supporting the mission of public television. The last thing they want to get into is a partisan fight of any kind. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the funding process, and because I'm usually in some of those meetings, but David really commandeers that process and does it extremely well.
I am so glad you asked this. I never get to talk about this. And I'm not going to bore you. I'm always amazed, particularly when we go to film schools or talk to students that want to go into our business. They all have this incredible, profound sense of a mission. I have the great idea that I want to film. It's just going to be a killer. It's going to be the best. Until they realize they have to actually raise funds. And then the eyes kind of roll back and you kind of do the, oh gosh, yeah, I forgot about that. The process is not arcane, nor is it complex. It really is looking at each individual documentary that we do, who makes the most sense in funding a project like this. In fact, we may have a funder here tonight for one of our documentaries, and I say that in all sincerity because we may.
And I'm hoping we do.
And we've actually got material to hand out. In the case of Boeing, they really were looking at, from their let me back up. Boeing generates 2% of all of the exports of the United States. Did you know that? 2%, one company. 95 or 98% of their workforce is US based. Nothing is outsourced, very little. Almost 90% of their product goes overseas. So they're a quintessential American company, and I think, without getting into a discussion that they had with me, because they didn't, I think they looked at what's the role of government from a business standpoint. And that's not something that I actually knew going in, but I very quickly knew after my first meeting that that was really key to what they were looking for. And we provided a very good vehicle for them, in the case of Ronald Reagan, objective look at him, to do the funding of that particular documentary. And then BNSF I look at as just being America. It's the grittiness, it's the rails, it's what this country really was founded on, and the emergence into the 20th century was really based in part on rail. So all of our projects are funded differently. We also have foundations that also work with us. In fact, there's a major foundation that's involved in this called the Brinson Family Foundation based in Chicago. But it's all different for every documentary. I will say, though, in this case, with this documentary, this is, of our long career, this is the largest, by far, project that I've ever been involved in. And I don't encourage miniseries for the faint of heart. It's a lot of work. What you're seeing is the tip of the iceberg. Everything below it is a big, big effort by a lot of people.
Just to complement that with one more thought, the productions that we're talking about are not-for-profit productions. Our partner, in most cases, is a public television affiliate. In this case, we call them a presenting station. In this case, Iowa Public Television is the presenting station. So the grant process works in such a way that the money that is provided to meet the budget of the film goes from the funder, in this case Boeing, BNSF, Brinson, and others, to Iowa Public Television. So our contract is with the affiliate, with Iowa Public Television. And it's an interesting relationship in that it's completely hands-off. Just like producing a 3-hour miniseries isn't for the faint of heart, it's also, when a big company like in this case Boeing or BNSF, is looking at funding. That's not for the faint of heart as companies go, because they know they cannot have any editorial input whatsoever into the production. So other than the meetings that we have in advance of the production, we really don't interact with our funder again until the production is completed.
In fact, in the case of Boeing, that happened. We were there in the middle of December, and that was the first chance that they actually got to see clips. We'll get to you, but I think Matt.
Yes, I mean, it's fascinating. We have a tremendous group of interview subjects. It was amazing to get people like Sandra Day O'Connor, Paul Volcker, Gary Hart, Pat Schroeder, from all different backgrounds that appear in the film. But among those who turned us down, there were a handful, and a lot of times it could be schedule. But we have Walter Mondale in the film, for example, but President Carter turned us down, as did President Bush Sr. And there were a number of other people who simply for scheduling reasons weren't able to. We have one of Reagan's speechwriters, Peter Robinson, is in the film. You might remember Peter. He wrote the Bring Down This Wall speech, the Berlin Wall speech. But we also tried to get Peggy Noonan, and we did not get Peggy Noonan. So it's a real hodgepodge, but we're aware that for any number of reasons, people will turn us down. Having said that, we're thrilled with those who said yes.
In fact, Walter Mondale has, I think, one of the great quotes in the entire film with regards to the Middle East. He said, if you want to make a mess of your foreign affairs, by all means get involved in the Middle East. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask about Nancy Reagan. Did she appear in any of your film, and was she interviewed?
Yeah, good question.
How is her help now?
Well, at the time we started production, we made the decision to, as I mentioned before, to limit it to 79 to 89. We also decided not to include the Reagan family. They're aware of the film, but we didn't include them because our direction was a little more policy driven. Having said that, it was really an interesting kind of chance encounter with Nancy Reagan that led to the production. David knows we were in production on the film on Herbert Hoover, and I happened to be having a meeting at the Bel Air Hotel in California on a different project, and I walked in to the restaurant, and it was kind of an old style, steakhouse restaurant environment, and with these kind of U-shaped booths. And I walked in, and we had a reservation. We're sitting in our booth, and I noticed her sitting in the very next booth. And I opened the menu, and on the menu was the Nancy Reagan Cobb salad. And I thought, well, if ever there was a time to order it, it's right now. So I ordered the salad, and coincidentally it arrived. I was in the middle of eating it when she decided to leave, and she walked right past me and looked down at my salad. And I just looked up at her and said, it's absolutely delicious. And she said, yes, it's lovely, isn't it? So, and it was at that point that I contacted David and said, we've done a vice president, we've done Herbert Hoover. If we're ever going to do, and the vice president, by the way, was Henry Wallace, and we've done Hoover, and if we're ever going to pursue a film on Reagan, now's the time, because the people from the administration, if we're going to get those who are still with us, now's the time. And of course, that led to the funding effort and to production. And so, but the family, other than their awareness of the film, no, they're not covered in it. Now, having one last quick thing is Judy Woodruff from PBS did do an extensive biography on Nancy Reagan that came out about a year ago. So we also felt that she would be covering a lot of that turf. Well, we thought that there were two things really. One was that the issues that we cover in the film are continuing to be relevant today. So we felt that we had relevance. But also, I think for me personally, I felt like we were a generation removed, and we were far enough removed that we felt we could take a journalistic approach to the content without it becoming a point-counterpoint kind of polemic battle. And so I think if we'd entered into a lot of the same discussion 15 years ago or 20 years ago, that it would have been more difficult to do this. But we were able to really make it a true historical piece. And so, in fact, that's one of the reasons we're looking at Truman now, is because you're starting to see enormous relevance with a lot of what, especially internationally, with a lot of what happened in Truman's administration. And so, you can take it out of the political world and leave it in the historical world.
You bring up a bigger question as well, and because we've now met a lot of people, hundreds. And for those that are Republican and conservative that we have met, that have come up to us, there has been this gushing of love for Reagan and almost a longing that there's nobody currently that has the vision and the courage that Reagan had that seems to be out there, at least for the Republican Party. And I find that curious. And I think Richard Reeve's opening comment in hour one, I thought when Reagan died, the Republican Party would spin out of control. What I didn't know or now know is that it's as if he never died. He still runs the Republican Party, which I think is quite an interesting, not only, why'd you select that?
As the opening?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's the most, it says it all. It's the relevance. But Richard Reeves, is one of 3 presidential historians in the film. And he wrote a book called The Triumph of Imagination. The other 2 presidential historians are Douglas Brinkley and Chiron Skinner. And so, and they all have, different areas of expertise. Just to elaborate a little bit on that, Chiron Skinner's area of expertise, and it comes through in the film, is how Reagan, how he redefined the electorate. And so we get into that a little bit in the beginning of hour 1, and we come back to it at the end of hour 3.
You don't see a lot of Reagan's personality. I'll tell you a real quick funny story about Reagan. When we did the film shoot in Los Angeles, we were in his boardroom, literally, and Chip, we had a teleprompter, and Chip had X'd out on the floor. He put 2 X's down for each foot and an X in the middle to line the president up to the teleprompter. So the president came in, and I greeted him and brought him over and introduced him to the director and the photographer. And then Chip said, "Mr. President, we need you to come over here." And he went over and he looked down at the X's, and Chip said, "Okay, now your left foot goes on the left X, and your right foot goes on the right X." And he stood there and he looked down at the center X and he said, "I don't believe I have a leg that goes there." So which was so Reagan, and when the interview was over, the taping lasted, maybe 10 minutes, because he nailed it. He proceeded to tell us these wonderful stories for quite a while. In fact, we were going to interview, I think it was Art Linkletter. I think that was crazy. Ronald Reagan and Art Linkletter in one day. And for the younger set, he was a TV personality. But we had to cut him off. We literally it was unfortunate for us. We had to say, "Sorry, we've got to leave," because I think he had more stories.
He might have kept going.
Yeah. A couple more questions? Yeah. We'll come back to you. Yes, ma'am.
It's an event that we get into in hour 2 of the show, and it has to do with a massacre during the Lebanese Civil War, where to look at it, and I'm going to give you kind of quick overview, but the Phalangist Party had been elected in Lebanon, and Bashir Gemayel was the newly elected president who was assassinated shortly after he was elected. And this happened at a time when the PLO and Israel were essentially fighting back and forth using Lebanon as more or less a proxy situation. Shortly after the Gemayel assassination, the Phalangists had essentially put a ring around 2 Palestinian refugee camps called Sabra and Shatila. And it was because they kind of controlled the zone, they went in shortly after the assassination attempt, and there was a large massacre of civilians in those 2 refugee camps. That led to enormous repercussions in Israel and a significant change in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And so we get into that extensively. And as Condi Rice talks about in the film, as Sam Lewis talks about in the film, if it were not for that, if it were not for the power vacuum that happens after that, Hezbollah would not have likely risen to the place that it has in today's political world. And so, those are the areas that we get into in hour 2 and hour 3 that I think are, they're things that Reagan could never have anticipated, or any president for that matter, and they really had little to do with American foreign policy at the time they happened. But the embassy bombing, the barracks bombing, the birth of Hezbollah, all of those things come after that event. And so that one massacre leads to an enormous number of consequences that are just get into the complexities of being president.
Douglas Brinkley makes a reference to Reagan being shot and how that profoundly changed his presidency. That happened 8 weeks after he was inaugurated.
So that's another example. I mean, there are many. And so, if you look at the current administration, there was no way that they could necessarily have anticipated what happened in Benghazi. Likewise, it was difficult for Reagan to have ever anticipated the massacre, or the bombing of the U.S. Embassy. And those events, the long-term repercussions of those things is what we get into in hour 2 and hour 3. Really, for me, as I've mentioned a couple times, it was more about the presidency than about him. The one thing I will say, though, and we mentioned it early in the film, but we don't spend a lot of time on it, is he was called the great communicator. And we have spent so much time combing through the speeches. And we also, by the way, we include videotapes of the radio addresses that he did are in hour 2 and hour 3. And we spent so much time on those clips of Reagan that you really do get a sense of his eloquence and his rhetorical skills. And, as someone who lived through it, in the early 1980s, I was a bluegrass musician. So I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the Reagan administration at that time.
I had someone that came up to me this last week and said, I thought Reagan was very courageous. I had not heard that. And I hadn't thought of it in those terms, and I think that stands out, his courage. I mean, he didn't waver. I mean, he didn't have 52 items that he wanted to do when he became president. He had 4. And they're shown at the very beginning of hour 1 in an address to Congress. And that's really what he stuck to. And I see Cleves is jumping up. I think
Thank you, David and Chip, for such an insightful documentary. Really enjoyed these clips, really tease it up, I think, for us to enjoy the entire 3 hours. I'm Cleves Whitney, as mentioned, and I'm very proud to help host this evening. And I want to just say thank you to our other 2 hosts who co-hosted this evening. It'd be Michael Walenta at WGVU, and also, I think I've got his name right, Cliff Martin at the Ford School. Thank you so much for being here. And I also have a shout out for Matt McLogan. Matt called me up several months ago, and he's the one who put the event this evening on our radar, and so we were just delighted to be able to host this. What an insightful film. They're just 2 brief comments I have. I would like to link the foreign policy and PATCO. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State during that period, made a very, very interesting comment later. He said that Reagan's decision, his toughness with the PATCO strikers, was the most important foreign policy decision that Reagan made, because it telegraphed to the Soviet leaders that Reagan meant business, that if your word was your bond when you started to negotiate with Reagan. So that was a very important point that Secretary of State Shultz made, linking those 2. And the second thing, David, you asked why Reagan, why now? I think on everybody's mind now, something that's certainly been on our minds at the Hauenstein Center is the lack of bipartisan cooperation in Washington and the urgent need to bring back the spirit of this. Now, no one doubts that Reagan had these really strong principles and he could be stubborn with them, but Reagan also had the gift of being able to work with people with whom he disagreed in a good spirit. And there's a wonderful anecdote that goes far to explain the spirit of Ronald Reagan in his autobiography when he talks about an event that he and Nancy hosted a dinner several months after the inauguration. He had recovered from the assassination attempt, and he describes it as a very warm and wonderful evening. Tip O'Neill came over, the Speaker of the House, and Reagan and O'Neill traded their Irish stories that they had learned from their father. He says to the point of exhausting the spouses and the waitstaff and everybody else around them. But Reagan said, at the end of the evening, I knew I had a friend in Tip O'Neill. We had become friends. The next day, Tip O'Neill said something that a Washington Post reporter picked up, criticizing the Economic Recovery Act and some of the spending cuts that Ronald Reagan was recommending. Reagan says he had hurt feelings. He picked up the phone and he called Tip O'Neill across the street. He said, I'm disappointed in what you said. And Tip O'Neill responded, he said, "Old buddy, you got to learn about politics in Washington. Before 6 o'clock, it's politics. We're not necessarily friends before 6 o'clock, but after 6 o'clock, I'll go have a beer with you or a good sip and scotch anywhere you want to go. And so every time Ronald Reagan ran into Tip O'Neill after that, he'd always look at his watch. He'd say, Tip, I think it's 6 o'clock. Well, I also want to tee up, just as the final comment this evening, that on March 7th, our good friends at the Ford Presidential Museum, represented by Elaine Didier in the back there. Elaine, thank you for being here this evening. March 7th, we're going to bring in H.W. Brands to talk about what makes a great president. And what Bill Brands is going to focus on is the presidency of Ronald Reagan. March 7th, 7 o'clock at the Ford Museum. We hope you can be there. Thank you so much for being here this evening.